The chandeliers sparkled like frozen raindrops suspended in midair. The ballroom was alive with laughter, music, and the soft clinking of crystal glasses. It was a night meant to impress, a night where wealth was not just displayed but flaunted. Expensive gowns brushed across polished marble floors and tuxedos lined with silk shimmered under the golden light. Every detail in that grand room was meant to speak of power, money, and exclusivity. But in the corner, away from the grand piano and away from the crowd, a woman moved quietly with a mop and a bucket. Her uniform was plain green, her gloves thin, and her shoes had grown used to endless hours of standing. She was the janitor of the night, hired to keep the spectacle spotless while the powerful mingled. Few looked at her, and those who did saw nothing more than a shadow, a background presence to be ignored. Her name was Angela. She was calm, steady, and carried herself with quiet grace, but in a room where money defined worth, she appeared invisible. No one asked about her life, her story, or her purpose for being there. To them, she was just another worker passing through their kingdom of luxury. The party was hosted by the Whitlock family, a dynasty of billionaires whose fortunes stretched across industries, real estate, oil, technology, and more. To be invited to one of their parties was to be given a chance to step into their gilded world, and people craved it. Politicians, celebrities, and executives filled the room, eager to stay on the Whitlocks' good side. The family stood tall in the center of the room, smiling as if they owned not just wealth but the very air everyone breathed. They thrived on attention, and they knew how to command it. Guests flattered them endlessly, hoping to earn favors. Yet for all their polished appearances, their arrogance seeped through in their laughter, their condescending tone, and the way they treated those they believed were beneath them. Angela continued her work silently, her hands moving methodically as she wiped away invisible spills and polished what already gleamed. She had learned long ago that silence often carried more dignity than unnecessary words. But that night, the quiet dignity she carried would be tested. As she passed by the edge of the dance floor, a young woman in a red silk gown laughed loudly, catching the attention of her friends. She pointed at Angela with a mocking grin, whispering something that caused the group to erupt into laughter. Their laughter was sharp, not the kind that lightened hearts, but the kind that cut. Heads turned, others smirked, and Angela felt the weight of the attention fall upon her like cold rain. She did not flinch. Her hands kept working. She had seen enough in her life to know that dignity was not given by others. It was something she carried within. But the Whitlocks thrived on cruelty disguised as humor. To them, mocking others was entertainment, a show of their supposed superiority. They saw her as a stage prop, a convenient character to belittle in order to amuse their circle. And while the music played and the glasses clinked, the laughter around her grew louder. Angela lifted her eyes just once, meeting their gazes. She did not return their mockery with anger. Instead, her look was calm, steady, and unreadable. For a brief moment, it unsettled them, but arrogance quickly returned to their smiles. On the surface, Angela appeared to be just a janitor, one who had to endure insults in order to earn her pay. But what no one in that room knew was that she was far more than what they assumed. Behind her simple uniform lay a woman of remarkable strength and vision. She had built her own success through years of quiet perseverance. While others had chased glitter and applause, she had worked silently, investing, building, and shaping her own path. She was not in that ballroom by accident. Her phone buzzed quietly in her pocket, pulling her attention away from the cruel laughter. She excused herself toward a quieter corner of the room and lifted it to her ear. The voice on the other end was respectful, urgent even. They were asking for her confirmation, awaiting her word. Angela listened patiently, her face calm, her posture steady. And then, in a voice soft yet powerful, she gave an answer that would change everything. Cancel the deal. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of $1 billion. As she ended the call, she slipped the phone back into her pocket and returned to her cart. To anyone watching, it seemed like nothing had changed. The janitor was back to her quiet work. The party continued in its loud glamour. The Whitlocks laughed, unaware of the storm that had just been set in motion. But beneath the glittering lights of that grand ballroom, a silent truth had just been written. A truth that would soon shake the very foundation of the Whitlocks' empire. Angela had the power they never imagined. and her quiet choice in that moment would echo louder than all the laughter in that room combined. The night was only beginning, but already, history was being rewritten in silence. The music in the ballroom rose louder, the violinists pouring their hearts into the melody. But the laughter of the Whitlocks and their friends was sharper than the strings. It rang out across the room, not with joy but with ridicule, aimed at the woman who quietly pushed her cart along the polished marble floor. Angela did not break her rhythm. Her hands moved with the same steady patience as they always had, the mop gliding across the spotless surface, her gaze calm. But the room around her was filled with smirks, whispers, and the kind of laughter that revealed more about the people laughing than about the one they mocked. One of the young heirs, flushed from too much champagne, pointed his glass toward her and called out with a voice loud enough to silence the nearby conversations. His words were meant to sting, to draw attention, to turn her presence into a joke. A ripple of laughter followed, the kind of laughter that people gave when they wanted to be seen agreeing with power, even if their hearts did not share in the cruelty. Guests turned their heads toward Angela, not to see her work but to watch how she would react to being humiliated in front of hundreds. Angela paused only for a moment, just long enough to meet their eyes. Her expression did not tremble. Her body did not shrink, her lips did not part to defend herself. She simply looked at them, her gaze steady, and then returned to her work. That silent dignity unsettled a few of the guests, though they quickly masked their discomfort with more laughter. The Whitlocks did not notice the unease. They were too comfortable in their belief that money excused cruelty, that mocking others was proof of superiority. The hall sparkled with chandeliers, polished silver and gowns worth more than the lifetime earnings of many outside that mansion. But in that moment, the grandeur of the room could not hide the smallness of those who mocked. Their voices echoed against marble walls, yet their hearts sounded hollow. They laughed at a uniform, at gloves and a cart, at a woman they believed held no power. What they did not know was that the same woman they ridiculed was silently holding the future of their empire in her hands. Angela had faced mockery before. She had worked in places where her worth was questioned, where her appearance was judged before her words were heard. Years of facing prejudice had taught her not to let the cruelty of others define her. She had built her strength in silence, and tonight would be no different. The Whitlocks thought they were writing her story by mocking her, but she knew her story had already been written with resilience, patience, and vision. Behind the laughter, there were eyes in the room that noticed more than the Whitlocks realized. A few guests, successful in their own right, shifted uncomfortably as they watched. They had come to the party hoping to strengthen alliances, but what they saw was arrogance at its peak. They wondered quietly if such arrogance could one day cost the Whitlocks more than they imagined. Still no one spoke up. The fear of losing favor kept their lips sealed. Angela's phone buzzed again in her pocket. She stepped aside toward a corner where the chandelier's light dimmed, her back turned from the spectacle of mockery. She lifted the phone and spoke softly, her tone even, her words measured. On the other end of the line, the voice was respectful, attentive. It was not the tone one used for a janitor, but the tone one used for a decision-maker. $1 billion deal hung in the balance, and the final word belonged to her. The Whitlocks continued their laughter, unaware that the woman they insulted was the very person who held the pen over their contract. Their arrogance blinded them. To them, power was in titles, in bank accounts, in the size of their house. They could not see that real power sometimes stood silently, wearing a uniform, carrying a mop, and listening more than speaking. Angela ended the call with the same calmness she carried in her work. She did not need to raise her voice, did not need to confront the Whitlocks in that moment. True power did not require a stage or applause. It was enough for her to know that their laughter was temporary, while her decision would leave a mark far greater than their cruelty. She returned to her cart, pushing it along the edge of the room. The party roared on, but beneath the music and laughter, an invisible thread of change had already been set in motion. The Whitlocks were laughing at what they thought was weakness, but they were unknowingly laughing in the face of their own downfall. The empire they had built so proudly, the empire they believed untouchable, was already beginning to tremble, and the cracks would soon be impossible to ignore. Angela worked in silence, but her silence was not emptiness. It was the silence of strength. The silence of a woman who did not need to prove her worth to those too blind to see it. While the Whitlocks mocked, she remained unmoved, and in her steadiness was a quiet power stronger than their arrogance. In that ballroom, two worlds collided. One was filled with glitter, arrogance, and shallow laughter. The other was filled with dignity, patience, and hidden power. And though the Whitlocks believed their world would always win, the night was slowly teaching them a lesson they would never forget. The mockery they thought was harmless entertainment was in truth a turning point, the beginning of a story that would reshape their future. For the first time, their laughter carried an echo they did not hear, an echo of consequences waiting in the shadows, carried silently in the heart of the woman they mocked. And so the party continued, but the night had already shifted. The Whitlocks believed themselves untouchable, but fate had already chosen its moment. It would not be their laughter that history remembered. It would be the quiet dignity of the woman they ridiculed, the woman who carried in her silence the power to cancel not only a deal, but the very illusion of superiority they lived by. The music softened for a moment as the pianist took the stage, his fingers brushing the keys with delicate grace. Guests swayed and whispered in admiration, sipping champagne and laughing as though nothing in the world could ever disturb their comfort. The Whitlock family stood tall in the center, basking in the glow of their own wealth, their arrogance shining brighter than the chandeliers above. To them, this was not just a party, but a performance, a reminder to the world that they were powerful enough to control everything around them. Yet in the midst of their confidence, one woman stood apart, her presence so ordinary to the crowd that they barely gave her a glance. Angela continued to move with quiet patience, pushing her cart, her gloves still damp from work. But her eyes were focused, her ears attuned to more than the music, because her phone began to buzz softly inside her pocket. She stepped into the corner of the grand room, away from the laughter, away from the gaze of those who had mocked her moments ago. With practiced composure, she pulled the phone out and lifted it to her ear. On the other end was not a friend, not a co-worker, but an executive waiting for her decision. The man's voice trembled with a mix of urgency and respect, his words careful, his tone deferential. He asked if she had made her final choice regarding the billion-dollar contract that had been months in negotiation. All eyes outside the phone call were fixed on the Whitlocks, but the real stage was here in this quiet corner where Angela stood. She listened without interruption, her breathing steady, her gaze lowering to the polished marble floor that reflected both her simple shoes and the glittering gowns dancing across the room. The Whitlocks had no idea that while they mocked her uniform, she was holding in her hands the power to determine the future of their empire. They had treated her like background noise, like a piece of furniture meant to be ignored, but what they failed to realize was that the janitor they ridiculed was also a woman of influence, someone who had built herself through years of determination and vision. She had grown up in hardship, had studied quietly while working long hours, had invested every dollar with patience and wisdom, until her decisions commanded respect in boardrooms filled with men who once doubted her. Tonight she had chosen to walk into the party not as a guest but as a worker, testing not the marble floors but the character of the family who thought themselves invincible. The executive spoke again, pressing her for clarity. Angela's eyes lifted for a moment, and across the room, she saw the Whitlocks laughing once more, raising their glasses, pointing toward her as though her very existence was a joke, meant for their entertainment. The sound echoed across the walls, but Angela did not break. Instead, she spoke into the phone, her voice steady and low. She said 5 words that would shift the course of the Whitlocks' legacy forever. Cancel the billion-dollar deal. The executive on the other end was silent for a moment, perhaps shocked at the firmness of her decision, but he did not question it. He understood who she was, what she represented, and what her words meant. He confirmed respectfully, his tone almost reverent, and promised to act immediately. With that, Angela ended the call and slid her phone back into her pocket. Her face did not change, her body did not tense. She simply returned to her cart and continued her work as though nothing at all had happened. The Whitlocks had no idea that in the span of a few seconds, their empire had shifted. Their billion-dollar future, the deal they had been celebrating even before its finalization, had just vanished in silence. No announcement, no confrontation, no raised voice, only a quiet decision made by the woman they had mocked. Angela knew that real power did not need to shout, did not need to make a spectacle. Real power moved quietly, making choices that rippled across industries without ever lifting its chin in arrogance. As the night wore on, a few guests began to whisper. One man, An investor who had spent weeks in meetings thought he recognized her. He squinted across the room, remembering a boardroom where a woman had sat with calm authority, asking questions no one else dared to ask, guiding the conversation with patience and clarity. He realized with a chill that the janitor pushing the cart was the same woman whose voice he had followed in business meetings. He whispered this to the guest beside him, and the realization spread slowly like a secret the room was not ready to hear. Yet the Whitlocks laughed on, oblivious. They raised their glasses higher, proud of their own cruelty, unaware that every word of mockery had been heard not just by a janitor, but by the very woman who had been their silent partner in business. And while they celebrated, their fortune was already unraveling in the background, calls being made, contracts withdrawn, trust dissolving. Angela did not need to announce what she had done. The consequences would arrive on their own, steady and undeniable. In that ballroom, arrogance and dignity existed side by side. On one end, the Whitlocks lived in the illusion of untouchable power, mocking those they thought beneath them. On the other, Angela stood steady, carrying within her the quiet truth that power is not measured by gowns or chandeliers, but by choices that shape destinies. Her decision had already been made, and though no one in the room yet realized it, the Whitlocks had mocked themselves more than they had mocked her. As Angela moved back into the shadows, the sound of music and laughter filled the air once again, but within her heart there was no bitterness, no desire for revenge. There was only calm resolve, the knowledge that she had chosen dignity over cruelty, and that the world would soon see the truth. The Whitlocks believed the night belonged to them, but Angela knew differently. This night would not be remembered for the grandeur of their party, but for the quiet strength of the woman who walked unnoticed among them and made a decision that would rewrite their legacy forever. The ballroom had grown even louder, the air thick with music, perfumes, and the prideful laughter of people who believed nothing could ever touch them. Waiters carried trays of golden glasses. Conversations swirled around stocks and luxury vacations, and the Whitlocks moved through the room like royalty inspecting their court. Every smile they gave was calculated, every word rehearsed, every laugh designed to show their wealth and importance. To them, the party was proof of their place at the top of the world. Yet beneath the surface of this carefully staged celebration, whispers had begun to form. It started with a single guest. He was a man who had attended more boardroom meetings than cocktail parties, a man who recognized faces more than gowns. His eyes had lingered on Angela longer than most, and somewhere deep in his memory, a thought stirred. He leaned closer to his companion and whispered what he had realized, that the woman pushing the cart was not just a janitor, but the same woman who had spoken with authority in high-level meetings. His companion frowned, doubtful at first, but curiosity crept in. They both turned to look at her again. The idea spread slowly, like a rumor crawling through the air. Another guest remembered hearing her voice on a conference call. Someone else recalled a signature at the bottom of a document, neat and deliberate, belonging to a name that now sounded familiar. The whispers grew, weaving through the crowd like an invisible thread. For the first time that night, people's attention shifted away from the Whitlocks' performance and toward the quiet figure in the corner. Angela felt their eyes on her, but she did not return their stares. She continued to work as though nothing had changed, her movements calm and steady, her face unreadable. Years of practice had taught her not to reveal her thoughts too soon. She had no desire to humiliate anyone. Her dignity came from restraint, not from spectacle. Yet she knew the truth had begun to leak, and once truth begins to leak, it cannot be contained. One of the Whitlock sons noticed the change in the room. He saw the glances being cast toward Angela, the curious looks, the hushed words. His arrogance was too strong to believe it meant anything significant, so he chose to laugh louder, to mock her again, pulling attention back to himself. But the guests were no longer laughing as freely. Their smiles wavered, their laughter thinned. Something about the janitor no longer seemed so simple, no longer so dismissible. The patriarch of the Whitlock family, a man who had built much of their fortune through ruthless deals, eventually caught wind of the whispers. He narrowed his eyes, studying Angela for the first time all night. To him, she had been invisible, but now he saw her standing calmly, unbothered by their grandeur, unaffected by their cruelty. Something about her stillness unsettled him. He had spent a lifetime reading people in business, And what he saw in her eyes was not the emptiness of a servant, but the composure of someone who had nothing to fear. The revelation spread faster now. Guests began to murmur that the Whitlocks' long-awaited billion-dollar deal had just collapsed. Calls were being made outside the ballroom and phones buzzed with news that contracts were being withdrawn. The timing was too sharp to be coincidence. More and more faces turned toward Angela, the supposed janitor, and realization dawned. She had been the one with the final say. She was the decision-maker. She was the one they should have been honoring instead of mocking. The room began to shift in mood. The music played on, but the atmosphere grew heavy. The laughter felt forced now, the arrogance cracking at its edges. The Whitlocks, oblivious a moment before, began to sense that something was wrong. They called for their advisors, but their advisors were already outside the ballroom, frantically making calls they could not control. Panic started to creep into their proud expressions, but they fought to mask it, still clinging to the image of power. Angela finished wiping a section of the floor and placed the mop back in her cart. She straightened slowly, her posture calm, her breathing steady. She looked across the room just once, meeting the eyes of the patriarch. There was no anger in her gaze, no triumph, only a quiet steadiness that spoke louder than words. In that single glance he understood. He understood that the woman they had mocked had been the very foundation of the deal they celebrated. He understood that their arrogance had cost them not only respect but the future of their empire. The guests shifted uneasily. Many who had laughed earlier now avoided looking at her, embarrassed by their own silence, ashamed of the cruelty they had joined. Some wished they had spoken up, others wished they had simply walked away. But regret is a late teacher, and tonight it came too late. The Whitlocks tried to regain control of the room, raising their glasses, smiling wider, speaking louder, but the more they tried, the more hollow it felt. The truth was out. Everyone knew the woman in the janitor's uniform was the one who had canceled their billion-dollar deal, and nothing could undo that knowledge. Angela did not speak a word. She did not need to. Her silence was heavier than their voices, her calm stronger than their arrogance. She pushed her cart slowly toward the door, her steps unhurried. The room parted slightly, as though even those who had mocked her earlier now recognized something greater in her presence. She walked away not in anger, not in revenge, but in dignity, leaving behind a room full of people who suddenly saw themselves more clearly than ever before. The revelation was complete. The Whitlocks, who believed they were untouchable, had been undone not by a competitor, not by an enemy, but by their own arrogance, their own inability to see beyond appearances. They had mocked a woman they thought powerless, and in doing so, they had mocked the very person who held their future in her hands. The music faded, the laughter died, and the grandeur of the ballroom seemed smaller than ever, and in that silence the truth hung in the air. Respect is worth more than money. Dignity is stronger than arrogance, and the most powerful people are often the ones we overlook. The night that began with pride and glitter was now unraveling into unease. The chandeliers still glowed, the musicians still played, and the waiters still carried trays, but beneath the surface, tension was spreading like cracks across glass. Guests shifted in their seats, whispers filled corners, and phones buzzed with news that no one wanted to hear. The billion-dollar deal that the Whitlocks had built their confidence upon had collapsed, and the realization spread through the ballroom like a cold wind extinguishing candles. The Whitlocks tried to ignore it at first. They had lived their entire lives believing that their wealth made them immune to setbacks, that problems could be silenced with money. The patriarch, his voice loud and commanding, called for calm, brushing off the whispers as rumors. He told his guests to enjoy the party, insisting that nothing was wrong, that the Whitlocks remained as strong as ever. Yet his eyes betrayed him. The steady calm he once carried had been replaced by something else: fear. It was not the fear of losing money, after all, billionaires had lost money before. It was the fear of losing power, of losing control over how the world saw them. Angela had not spoken a word to them. She had not confronted them, had not raised her voice, had not declared what she had done, but her silence had been enough. The quiet cancellation of their deal had triggered an avalanche, and now the very people who once begged for the Whitlocks' attention were questioning their strength. Business partners were calling, investors were withdrawing, and friends who came to flatter them were already considering distancing themselves. In a world built on reputation, Their arrogance had pushed them into freefall. The young heirs who mocked Angela earlier were no longer laughing. Their smirks had faded into pale silence. They glanced nervously at one another, realizing that their cruelty had played a role in this collapse. For the first time, they saw the connection between their arrogance and their downfall, but they could not undo it. Words once spoken cannot be retrieved, and actions once taken cannot be erased. The collapse was not loud. It was not dramatic in the way of crashing chandeliers or broken glass. It was quiet, like the soft tearing of fabric, slow but unstoppable. Emails were sent, contracts revoked, and alliances dissolved. The Whitlocks, who once stood as symbols of control, now looked small in the eyes of those around them. Their guests continued to dance and drink, but the atmosphere had shifted. Everyone in that ballroom knew they were witnessing the beginning of the end for a family who once believed themselves untouchable. Angela did not stay to watch their panic. She moved quietly through the hall. Her work finished, her cart steady before her. She had no need to see the collapse unfold. She knew how it would end because arrogance always ends the same way. It begins with pride, grows into cruelty, and falls apart when the weight of its own blindness becomes too heavy to bear. She left the ballroom with the same calm she had carried into it, her dignity intact, her silence unbroken. Outside, the night was cool. The stars scattered across the sky like distant lanterns. Angela breathed deeply, feeling no triumph, no anger, only peace. She had not canceled the deal to seek revenge. She had canceled it because respect mattered more than numbers, because dignity mattered more than profits. In a world obsessed with appearances, she had chosen to stand by principle, and that choice had revealed the truth of those who mocked her. Back inside, the Whitlocks huddled together, their voices sharp with panic. They called for advisors, demanded answers, searched for someone to blame. But blame could not undo what had been lost. Their empire was trembling, and the more they tried to hold it together, the faster it slipped from their grasp. The guests who once smiled at them now watched with distant curiosity, some even with quiet satisfaction. Arrogance had made the Whitlocks enemies they never noticed, and now those enemies were watching their fall with interest. The collapse did not happen in a single night, but the night was its beginning. Newspapers would soon write of failed deals, investors would speak of betrayal, and competitors would grow stronger in the space the Whitlocks left behind. Their name, once a symbol of wealth and power, would become a cautionary tale. All because they mocked a woman they thought powerless, all because they forgot that true strength is measured not in money but in the way one treats others. Angela's story was different. She returned home that night not to a mansion or a palace, but to a modest house filled with warmth and peace. She did not measure her worth by the grandeur of her surroundings, but by the quiet certainty that she had lived true to her values. She poured herself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and let the silence of the night embrace her. For her, the collapse of the Whitlocks was not a victory. It was a lesson, one the world would remember long after the party had been forgotten. The Whitlocks would spend months trying to recover, but recovery without humility is fragile. They would search for new deals, but partners would hesitate. They would try to repair their image, but the stain of their arrogance could not be erased easily. Their empire had been shaken at its core, not by market shifts or competitors, but by their own behavior. And that truth would follow them wherever they went. In the ballroom that night, the chandeliers still sparkled, but their light no longer felt proud. It felt cold, like the reflection of a family who had lost more than money. The guests began to leave one by one, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors, their conversations hushed. By the end of the night, the Whitlocks stood in the empty hall, their grandeur reduced to silence. They looked around at the remains of their celebration and saw it for what it truly was, a mask that had finally slipped. The collapse of the Whitlocks was not just financial. It was moral, social, and personal. It was the collapse of arrogance, the unraveling of pride, the shattering of illusions. And though they would spend years trying to rebuild, the memory of that night would never leave them. For in the end, it was not the market that defeated them. It was the laughter they thought harmless, the cruelty they thought entertaining, the blindness they thought strength. And somewhere far from their mansion, Angela slept peacefully, her heart unburdened, her spirit unshaken, for she had learned long ago that silence, dignity, and principle could move mountains more than wealth ever could. The Whitlocks would learn it too. though their lesson came at the cost of everything they once believed untouchable. The morning after the grand party, the Whitlocks woke to a world that no longer admired them as it once did. Newspapers carried whispers of their failed deal. Investors pulled back with caution, and those who had once gathered around them with admiration now kept their distance. The empire they had paraded in front of their guests had cracked overnight. Their phones buzzed endlessly, but the voices on the other end were no longer flattering. They were sharp, demanding, uncertain. The billion-dollar future they had promised was gone, and in its place was silence, broken only by the echoes of questions they could not answer. The Whitlock patriarch sat at the long dining table, his hands clenched around a cup of coffee gone cold. His children sat across from him, their faces pale and drawn. They were used to waking up with confidence, used to stepping into the world believing their name alone carried power. But now they carried something heavier, the memory of their own laughter, the weight of their own cruelty, and the knowledge that their arrogance had led them here. For the first time in their lives, they were forced to see that money could not protect them from the consequences of how they treated others. Angela, however, began her day quietly. She rose early, just as she always did, and walked through the calm of her modest home. She brewed tea, watched the light of dawn break across the horizon, and breathed in the stillness. The world outside was already buzzing with news of the Whitlocks' collapse, but in her home, there was no noise, no panic, only peace. She had never needed the grandeur of chandeliers or the hollow praise of strangers. Her strength had always come from knowing who she was and holding on to it with dignity. The lesson of that night did not belong only to the Whitlocks. It belonged to everyone who had watched, everyone who had stayed silent, everyone who had chosen to laugh instead of speak. The guests who had stood in that ballroom now carried their own regret. They had witnessed cruelty and chosen to join in or remain silent, believing it harmless. But they learned too that silence can wound as deeply as words, and laughter at the expense of another often turns bitter in memory. The lesson stretched beyond the walls of the mansion, reaching into boardrooms and offices, whispered in conversations across cities. Respect is not optional. The Whitlocks struggled to move forward. They tried to arrange new meetings, but their partners hesitated. They tried to spin the story, but the truth had already traveled too far. People remembered the images of them laughing at a woman they thought beneath them, and though no cameras had captured the scene, the witnesses became storytellers. Whispers grew into lessons retold at dinner tables and classrooms. Never mock someone because of their work. Never judge someone by their appearance. Never mistake silence for weakness. The world began to carry Angela's story, though she herself never told it. She did not seek recognition. She did not appear on television or write speeches about what had happened. She continued her life quietly, investing her time into work that mattered, mentoring those who needed guidance and offering kindness where it was rare. She believed that the strongest lessons were not shouted but lived, and so she lived her truth every day, walking with the same calm dignity she had carried into the ballroom. For the Whitlocks, the lesson came with pain. They were forced to see that their cruelty had not only cost them money, but had cost them respect, relationships, and trust. They tried to blame circumstances, tried to insist that the deal would have failed for other reasons, but deep down, they knew the truth. It was their laughter, their mockery, their inability to see the worth of another human being that had undone them. And no matter how many excuses they tried to build, the truth remained like a shadow they could not escape. The lesson was not just about money, not just about deals. It was about humanity. In mocking a woman they thought powerless, the Whitlocks revealed their own weakness. In dismissing her presence, they exposed their own blindness. And in losing everything, they were forced to learn the lesson Angela had carried all her life. Dignity is not granted by wealth, and respect is not a choice you give to some and withhold from others. It is the foundation of true strength. Time passed, and the memory of that night grew into a story told far beyond the city where it happened. People repeated it as a reminder to their children, as advice to their friends, as wisdom for their students. The image of a billionaire family mocking a janitor only to lose everything became a parable, a symbol of what arrogance can destroy and what dignity can protect. Angela remained quiet, living her life away from the spotlight, but her presence in that story became immortal. Meanwhile, the Whitlocks could no longer walk into a room with the same confidence. They were still wealthy, still living in luxury, but something inside them had changed. They had learned that money could not erase shame, that power built on arrogance collapses easily, and that the people they once dismissed could hold more influence than they ever imagined. They began to live with caution, but caution is not the same as humility, and so their struggle continued. The lesson did not belong to them alone. It belonged to everyone who thought power meant wealth, to everyone who thought appearances defined worth, to everyone who believed kindness was weakness. It reminded the world that the smallest actions, a cruel word, a mocking laugh, a silent choice, can change everything. It reminded people that true greatness is measured not in numbers but in the way we see and treat others. Angela never looked back on that night with pride or bitterness. She simply saw it as another step in her journey, a confirmation of what she had always known. Respect is the seed of trust, dignity is the root of strength, and kindness is the soil where true power grows. She had lived by those truths, and that night had proved them more powerfully than any speech or book ever could. The lesson of the Whitlocks' collapse was not about money at all. It was about humanity, about seeing beyond uniforms and titles, about recognizing the worth in every person. It was about the quiet strength of a woman who never needed the world to acknowledge her, in order to know her own value. And it was about the cost of arrogance, the emptiness of cruelty, and the inevitable fall of those who mistake laughter for superiority. In the end, the ballroom lights faded, the music silenced, and the grandeur forgotten. What remained was the story, the lesson, the echo of dignity that outlasted wealth, and that was enough. The story of that night in the Whitlocks' ballroom did not end when the chandeliers dimmed and the last guest left. Stories that carry truth never fade so easily. They linger, they spread, they grow, reshaping the way people think and reminding them of what truly matters. And so, while the Whitlocks tried to bury the memory of their humiliation beneath more wealth, more events, and more attempts at control, the lesson refused to be buried. It traveled quietly from one person to another, retold in whispers at dinner tables, in classrooms, in workplaces where dignity mattered more than appearances. It became a living memory, not because Angela told it, but because others could not forget it. Angela never sought recognition. She continued her life with the same quiet dignity she had always carried. Each morning she rose early. Each evening she found peace in the stillness of her modest home. She had no need for cameras or headlines. To her, the real success was not in destroying arrogance, but in living true to her values. She knew that the Whitlocks' downfall was not her victory, it was their lesson. And she knew that legacies are not built by what the world gives you, but by what you give the world through your choices. The Whitlocks, meanwhile, carried the memory of that night like a shadow they could not escape. They were still wealthy, still able to host parties, still able to travel the world in private jets and yachts. Yet everywhere they went, the memory followed. Business partners remembered the arrogance that had cost them $1 billion deal. Guests remembered the laughter that had turned sour. And the family themselves remembered the steady eyes of a woman they had mocked, eyes that had shown them more truth than they wanted to see. They were haunted not by what Angela had said, because she had said nothing, but by what she had shown them simply by being herself. As the months turned into years, the Whitlocks tried to rebuild. They secured smaller deals, tried to project an image of stability, even attempted charitable works to polish their reputation. But the memory was stronger than their efforts. People no longer admired them with the same blind awe. They had become an example, a reminder of how arrogance can destroy what money cannot protect. They had become a lesson, and being a lesson is far heavier than being a leader. Angela, however, built a different kind of legacy. She invested her time not in parties or displays, but in people. She mentored young men and women who reminded her of her younger self, full of potential yet overlooked by a world too busy measuring worth in the wrong ways. She taught them that strength is not in shouting, but in standing firm. Not in mocking others, but in lifting them up. She showed them that dignity is the one thing no one can take from you, and respect is the one thing you must give freely if you hope to receive it. Her words were simple, but her life was the proof. The story of the Whitlocks' collapse grew into something larger than any one family. It became a modern parable, a reminder told in classrooms and boardrooms alike. Teachers told their students never to judge others by their work or appearance. Leaders reminded their teams that arrogance is weakness disguised as confidence. Parents told their children that true power is not in wealth but in kindness. And everywhere the story was told, Angela's silence in that ballroom became louder than the Whitlock's laughter had ever been. For Angela, legacy was not about fame. It was about the quiet ripple of dignity that spreads when you choose to act with principle. She never looked back on that night with pride or anger. She saw it only as a moment where the truth revealed itself, a moment where the world was reminded that respect is not negotiable, that cruelty has consequences, and that appearances often hide deeper realities. She lived her life in the same way she had lived that night. Steady, calm, unshaken by the noise around her. The Whitlocks aged, their empire shrinking in influence, their names carrying less weight with each passing year. Some of them tried to change, tried to learn humility, tried to live differently, but for many the lesson had come too late. Regret filled their later years. Regret for laughter that had cost them respect. Regret for arrogance that had cost them trust. They learned that wealth can buy comfort but not forgiveness, luxury but not dignity. They learned, though painfully, that true legacy is not built in ballrooms but in hearts. Angela's story outlived theirs, not because she sought to make it so, but because truth always does. People remembered her as the woman who stood quietly in the face of mockery and chose dignity over anger, principle over pride. They remembered her as the woman who held the power to cancel a billion-dollar deal, yet walked away without the need to gloat. They remembered her as proof that greatness often hides in plain sight, wearing uniforms the world overlooks, carrying strength in silence. The legacy of that night was simple yet profound. It reminded the world that arrogance collapses but dignity endures. It reminded people that respect is not owed to wealth, but to humanity. And it reminded everyone who heard it that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one no one notices, until it is too late. Angela never needed a crown, never needed applause. Her legacy was written not in the grandeur of chandeliers, but in the quiet strength she carried within her. And that legacy lived on, long after the Whitlocks' empire had faded, long after the ballroom had been forgotten. For while wealth crumbles and power shifts, dignity remains, and the story of a woman who chose it will always be remembered.